Chers auditeurs,
Dear listeners,
bonjour.
welcome in Comme d'Archi Podcast Season 4.
Saison 4, dans le monde fascinant des architectes.
And in the architectural projects.
Je suis Anne-Charlotte Depondt, passionnée d'architecture et docteur des universités en histoire de l'archi.
I am one of the spokespersons of Anne-Charlotte, who is a PhD in architecture history.
Merci.
Thank you
D'être avec moi aujourd'hui.
to be with us today.
Et
And
maintenant,
now,
lundi en français, place au talent.
and Wednesday, let's talk projects. In English, of course.
Bienvenue dans Comme d'Archi.
Dear listeners, this is Esther on behalf of Anne-Charlotte. Welcome to the second Comme d'Archi part format dedicated to Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. Indeed, remember, I wanted us to meet today for a transversal reading around this great character belonging to the history of architecture. And yes, I remind you that Mies van der Rohe, who lived from 1886 to 1969, would be in the top 3 with Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier of the great masters of 20th century architecture. Obviously, there is no question of saying that this short format alone will settle the Mies question. There is no question of competing with eminent specialists, and on the contrary, we will reserve many other opportunities for this subject, as the themes that refer to this immense figure, father of the famous less is more, are so rich. History, teaching, modernity, international style, monographic readings on the works he left us, philosophy, influence, metal architecture, etc. Today, what interests us is this legacy of modernity. Today, obviously, it is no longer the so-called historical architecture, considered yesterday outdated, that pushes to renew the architectural approach, but rather this modernity, symbol of simplicity and speed, that has drifted, and here I am not talking about Mies, of course, so that has drifted with so many abuses, passing from the noble less is more to the cannibal low-cost plebiscite to make even more profit with less is less. A disastrous drift which in France has allowed the famous cubes of this very ordinary architecture to flourish. Whereas Mies, who spent his life searching with an unequaled seriousness, was adept at finesse, at structure, believing that the architecture of his time should not be reduced to a bunker. Unfortunately, on the contrary, this ordinary architecture that has spread over our territories has downgraded many other remarkable operations of the time. So, to try to reconnect with the essence of modernity, let's rediscover these few ideas that gravitate around Mies by quoting him. For what did Mies say about the new times, his own new times, those he lived through? In a speech he gave in June 1930 at the Vienna session, he concluded, "The new times are a fact. They exist regardless of whether we say yes or no to them. But they are neither better nor worse than any other time. They are a pure fact that is indifferent to its own value. That is why I will not stop to try to clarify the new times, to show their relations, or to reveal their fundamental structure. Nor do we want to overestimate the issue of mechanization, standardization, and normalization. And we want to accept as a fact the evolution of economic and social relations. All these things follow their fateful and value-blind course. Only the way in which we assert ourselves in the face of these facts will be decisive. Only then will the spiritual problems begin. What is decisive is not the what, but the how. Neither the production of goods nor the way we produce them has any spiritual significance. Whether we build high or low, steel or glass, tells us nothing about the value of the building. Whether urbanization tends towards centralization or decentralization is a practical question, not one of values. But the decisive question is precisely that of values. We must define new values, determine the ultimate goals in order to establish a scale of values. For each era, including our own, has meaning and justification only if it provides the conditions for the existence of the spirit. 35 years later, in 1965, Mies van der Rohe wrote in the foreword to Werner Blaser's book, Mies van der Rohe, die Kunst der Struktur, about the architecture of our time. I consciously entered the profession around 1910. The Jugendstil and Art Nouveau movements were coming to an end. Official buildings were more or less influenced by Palladio or Schinkel. But the real achievements of this period were the industrial and purely technical buildings. It was in fact an incoherent time, and no one could or would solve the question of the essence of architecture. Perhaps the time was not yet ripe for an answer. However, I raised the question and was determined to find an answer. It was only after the war, around the 1920s, that it became increasingly clear that technical development influenced many aspects of our lives. We discovered that technology was a civilizing force to be reckoned with. In the field of construction, the evolving technology made available new materials and more practical working methods that were often in sharp contrast to our traditional architectural concepts. And yet, I believed in the possibility of developing architecture with these new means. I felt that it should be possible to bring all the new forces in our civilization into harmony. Each of my buildings was a demonstration of these ideas and a step forward in the process of my own search for clarity. I became more and more convinced that these new scientific and technical developments are the true conditions for our architecture. I have never lost this conviction. Today, as for a long time, I believe that architecture has little or nothing to do with the invention of interesting forms or with individual tastes. True architecture is always objective and is an expression of the internal structure of the age that gives it birth. So I wonder, were the Trente Glorieuses, the 30-year post-war boom, worthy of this legacy? If today our first concern is the ecology and the refreshment of the cities, but also the rehabilitation, is it useful to break with this legacy? Does that Mies propose a timeless projection that goes beyond the question of the material? Doesn't the clarity have to summon today the frugality of which one speaks so much? The clarity, isn't it also to keep memory? For how can we rehabilitate if we lose our memory? If you wish to know more about Mies, or simply to hear his voice, if you have not already done so, I recommend that you listen to France Culture's series Les Bâtisseurs, episode 5 of July 31st, 2020. Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, 1886-1969, Simplicity is a Long Journey. Dear listeners, I am delighted to have shared this food for thought with you. Thank you for tuning in. Let's meet again next week for a new Comme d'Archi in English. And until then, take care of yourselves. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening. Thanks to Julien Rebourg, sound engineer, who is collaborating with us today. Don't forget to tune in to our previews on Instagram at Comme d'Archi Podcast. If you enjoy this podcast, don't hesitate to promote it by giving it 5 stars and a little comment on Apple Podcast or on your favorite podcast platform. And above all, subscribe to listen to all of our episodes for free. See you soon, and until then, take care of yourself.